Hi and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I do value studies in my sketchbook. And I think value studies are a great way. If you haven't heard of them before, they're basically when you take an image and you kind of break it down into its values, into the lights and darks. And I think they're a really great way to organize a painting, to improve composition, and to just help make sure that you have sort of clear ideas on the design of any image you're trying to make. For this sketch, I'm going to be sketching this little cute flower shop that I saw on a street corner in San Francisco. What drew me to the image was that it has these really strong light and shadow shapes that are being created by the strong afternoon light on the building. And I do find in general value studies are a lot easier to do if you have this strong light dark contrast. So if you haven't done them much before, I would recommend starting off with an image like this to get going. And I'm working in my pocket-sized sketchbook. It's pretty small, and I really like that for these value studies because it prevents you from getting too much into the details, and it really forces you to work on the big shapes. And to start off this value study, what I do is I first just marked off, so this image, it has some really dark shadow areas and then some really bright light areas. And so what I did was I first just lightly sketched in where where the bright light shapes are. There are just a few of them kind of in the top corner in the where the light is hitting the awning of the flower shop, the light on the sidewalk, and then also in the left, kind of on the left side in the corner and in the back part, there's more light. So what I do is I block off those shapes because they're really easy for me to identify. I can clearly see those highlighted shapes. And then I go in and I put just then an overall gray tone in the darker areas to establish this distinction between the areas that are in light and the areas that are in shadow. And once I get that mapped out, then I kind of have these really strong anchors to block in the other shapes. And so then I can start adding in the details and kind of going into these areas that I've created with smaller shapes. And with this drawing, when I look at the image, I see there's the interesting light and shadow contrast, but then I'm also seeing some interesting shapes within the shadows that I want to communicate. So I'm going to leave the light shapes relatively simple, and then I'm going to elaborate on some of the details within the shadow shapes. That includes the decoration on the buildings, such as the windows and kind of the facade of the building, and also, of course, the pots of flowers that are beside the flower shop to kind of communicate the idea of this cute little corner store. So to do this, what I do is I start taking this large kind of monolithic shadow shape that I've created, and then I start breaking it into different values within that dark value. So I create sort of a mid-tone value, and then I have an even darker value that allows me to distinguish the shapes within the shadow region. Now, one thing that I'm careful to do in this shadow region is to still keep all of the values in that area darker than the super light highlights. I think I've heard of people refer to this as like value grouping or having value groups, where within certain zones of the image, you group the values so that you can still distinguish between values in those zones, but then you're not making the values as extreme as values in other zones. So I'm kind of doing that here, where I have a mid-tone and then I have a darker tone, but I'm not bringing any really bright areas into this shadow shape. This allows me to preserve the overall design of my image while also adding some interesting nuance to the image. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to have the shapes relatively accurate to what I'm seeing in the image, but I'm not fussing too much about accuracy. I do want to keep this, I think that these exercises work really well when you try to go relatively fast, when you try to capture things without getting too precious about them, and it's more about the overall idea of the sketch rather than the minute details. Because in the end, this is just a sketch. This is working out an idea that I could, if I like, develop into a larger, more detailed painting. Also, as I'm working on this value study, I'm doing a lot of simplification. So you can see that the buildings that I'm drawing and the area where the flowers are is actually really detailed. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so I'm trying to do a lot of squinting and deciding which shapes do I want to elaborate on, which details do I want to include, and then what am I going to simplify, what am I going to leave out. One of the things that I was really cognizant of is giving this painting a bit, or this value study, a bit of a sense of perspective, because it is in San Francisco. It's on a hill that's sloping upwards, and so I wanted to give enough details to communicate this upward sloping hill so that it wasn't too confusing to the viewer. So I definitely wanted to include the flower pots, and so the sloping shape of the flower pots I think helps the viewer understand that the hill is sloping up. And then also the details of the windows that are a little bit further back in the top of the image. Those rectangles of the windows help give the study a little bit more perspective too. But I'm thinking about, I don't want to include all of the details because I think it could get really overwhelming, and it can also distract from the overall beauty and clarity of the light and shadow shapes. But at the same time, I do want to give some of these important details that help the viewer get a sense of perspective. And so I also add a little bit of the highlight on the curb, or the slightly lighter part of the curb, and I also include some more details of the building's facade that have like some lines that give a little bit of perspective, so we understand how the building is receding into space. And with that, I just add a few extra details. And then the study is basically done. Like I said, I try to keep these really simple. I try to go pretty fast. All in all, this one took me about 15 minutes. And I would recommend, if you want to do similar exercises, to, give yourself a time limit. Don't spend too long on them. Don't get too precious. Keep them pretty small so that you focus more on the big picture and don't get too caught up in the details. I think by going through exercises like this, you can learn so much about how to simplify shapes in an image, how to design a composition, which compositions you really like and why. And I think that these sorts of exercises can really contribute to the strength of the images that you create down the line. And I think it's also just a good way to practice making decisions about how we simplify, how we see values, what we choose to emphasize in a painting. You know, there's no right or wrong answer on how to do any of those things. It's really just subject to our own motivations, our own intentions, and our own individual taste. And I think that is something that you're just going to figure out over time. So here's the final image. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below. And as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.